The sun had not yet cleared the jagged ridgelines of central Tunisia when Major General Terry Allen stepped out of his forward command post on March 23, 1943. The cold desert wind bit at his face, carrying with it the familiar mixture of dust, diesel, and anticipation that preceded every major engagement. Allen lifted his binoculars, and there, emerging from the narrow stone throat of the mountain pass, came the dark silhouettes he had been expecting for nearly 24 hours. 50 German tanks, Mark IVs, veterans of a dozen battlefields. They descended in perfect formation, engines rumbling like distant thunder rolling across the Guettar Valley. But unlike the Americans who had faced them 1 month earlier at Kasserine Pass, these Americans were dug in, disciplined, and ready. A month earlier, humiliation at Kasserine. On February 19, 1943, the United States Army had suffered what many called the most humiliating defeat in its modern history. Rommel's Afrika Korps, hardened by years of combat, smashed into unprepared American lines at Kasserine Pass and broke them like brittle glass. Over the next 5 days, 6,500 American casualties. Nearly 200 tanks lost, dozens of guns abandoned, a retreat of nearly 80 kilometers. The Germans called Americans soft. The British whispered that Americans were not soldiers at all. Newspapers back home asked whether the United States should even be allowed to lead men into battle. What died at Kasserine was not only a defensive line, but the myth that enthusiasm could replace experience. Yet what was born in the aftermath would become one of the fastest and most profound military transformations in modern warfare. Eisenhower makes his decision. General Dwight Eisenhower understood something essential. America did not have a soldier problem. It had a leadership and doctrine problem. Kasserine exposed every weakness in the American command system. Units scattered across miles with no mutual support, artillery firing in isolated batteries instead of mass concentration, tanks charging piecemeal into experienced German formations, poor radio coordination, commanders positioned so far behind the lines that they could not even see the battlefield. Eisenhower's solution was swift and merciless. On March 6, 1943, Major General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved of command. His underground fortress, carved directly into the desert cliffs, symbolized everything wrong with American leadership: safety, distance, confusion, isolation. In his place, Eisenhower put a man who embodied the opposite of all that: Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a cavalryman with a volcanic temper, razor-sharp instincts, and an obsession with discipline so intense it bordered on religion. Patton's 17-day revolution. Patton took command of the two corps like a storm front. Within hours, soldiers who had gone weeks without seeing a senior officer suddenly found the new commander inspecting their positions, questioning their sergeants, correcting their posture, measuring their foxholes, and demanding discipline with a ferocity no one had witnessed since arriving in North Africa. Uniforms were to be clean, weapons spotless, vehicles maintained like surgical instruments. Every soldier was to wear leggings, helmets, proper insignia, or face punishment. Officers who did not enforce standards were removed on the spot. At first, the men cursed him. By the end of the second week, they understood. Patton wasn't building an army that looked good. He was building an army that believed it was good, because belief changes how men fight. The other half of the transformation: while Patton reshaped morale and discipline, Eisenhower's staff rebuilt doctrine. What failed at Kasserine? Everything. What had to change? Everything. In less than 4 weeks, the United States Army completely rewrote. Artillery coordination. Americans created a new fire control system, allowing mass concentrations of artillery, the same method Germans had been using for 3 years. Tank doctrine: tanks would no longer duel with German armor. Tank destroyers and artillery would handle that. American tanks would operate as infantry support weapons. Communications radio frequencies were standardized across units. Forward observers were given new protocols that allowed them to call fire from any battery in range. Command structure. No more penny packets. Units would fight together. Divisions would move as coherent, mutually supporting organisms. This was not improvement. This was rebirth. The first real test, Guettar. By March 17, Patton-Felt II Corps was ready. By March 18, American forces had taken the oasis town of Guettar. The terrain was ideal for defense. 2 ridge lines, a broad valley, predictable avenues of approach. Clear lines of fire. Allen's 1st Infantry Division dug in. Deeply, professionally, silently.
They laid minefields. They mapped every possible German route. They positioned artillery behind cover pre-registered on every grid square. Tank destroyers were buried so well that even American soldiers had difficulty spotting them from a distance of 50 meters. This was not the army of Kasserine. The Germans arrive at dawn on March 23rd. The 10th Panzer Division rolled out of the mountains. They expected another easy victory. They expected chaos. They expected Americans to break and run. Instead, they found no movement, no panic, no disorganized retreat, just silence. Professional, deliberate, deadly silence. And then, at 400 yards from the minefield, the valley erupted. But that is where Part E begins. After Kasserine, the American army faced a question that went far beyond North Africa. If they could not fight the Germans on equal terms, the entire Allied strategy for liberating Europe would collapse. British commanders whispered that Americans were too inexperienced, too undisciplined, too careless. German officers mocked them openly. Newspapers back home reported the defeat with brutal honesty. The psychological damage was as serious as the tactical one. And yet, within days, something began to change across the American ranks, quietly at first, but unmistakably. The first step was honesty. Not the comforting kind, but the brutal variety that dissected every error with surgical precision. Reports poured into Eisenhower's headquarters describing failures in communication, artillery coordination, defensive preparation, reconnaissance, and leadership. It was clear the problem was not the courage of the soldiers. It was the structure of the army guiding them. And unlike many military forces, the Americans did not cling to pride. They did not pretend the defeat was someone else's fault. They accepted full responsibility, then immediately set about fixing it. Patton's arrival accelerated everything. His strict discipline became famous almost overnight. Soldiers were ordered to wear full uniforms at all times. Helmets had to be strapped, leggings properly secured. Rifles cleaned to inspection standard every single day. Jeep drivers learned that Patton might appear out of nowhere, stop their vehicle, and examine their boots, belts, or ammunition pouches. Officers who failed to enforce standards were relieved on the spot. Some soldiers hated him, others feared him, but gradually, almost reluctantly, they began to respect him. For the first time since landing in North Africa, the men felt that someone knew exactly what had to be done. But discipline was only the surface. Beneath it, the real transformation was taking place in tactics, doctrine, and coordination. American artillery, already one of the Army's strongest assets, began to train in entirely new procedures. Artillery no longer acted as isolated battalions bound to a single observer. Fire direction centers were reorganized so any observer could call any gun within range. A single forward observer could now summon dozens of guns with one command. The idea sounded simple, but implementing it required new radio procedures, new coordination drills, and endless practice. Night after night, artillerymen rehearsed calculations, adjusted radios, and trained to fire massed missions within seconds. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. Tank crews saw equally drastic reforms. No more head-on duels with German panzers. No more charging forward without infantry. The new doctrine stated clearly, American tanks were to act as mobile fire support, not as hunter-killers. The job of killing German armor would belong to tank destroyers M10s with high-velocity guns, trained specifically for ambushes and precision engagements. Battalion commanders lectured crews, do not fight the German way. Fight the American way. Use your numbers, your mobility, your artillery. Make them come to you. Infantry units were pushed even harder. They learned to dig deeper foxholes, real fighting positions, not shallow scrapes that a German tank could flatten in seconds. They practiced coordinated withdrawals, rehearsed night operations, and trained with engineers to place mines across likely avenues of attack. Platoon leaders memorized terrain features and knew exactly where every neighboring unit sat. Recon teams drilled silent movement and long-range observation. observation. Bit by bit, the chaos that had defined Kasserine was replaced with something else: structure, cohesion, confidence. By the time Patton's 17 days were up, the difference was visible to anyone who saw the men march or prepare their positions. Vehicles were maintained with precision. Weapons were spotless. Battle drills were executed automatically, without hesitation. And most importantly, the soldiers no longer carried themselves like men expecting to lose. They believed they could hold their ground. They believed they could win. On March 17, American forces began pushing forward. They captured Gafsa with almost no resistance. Rangers seized Guettar the next day. There was a sense quiet and cautious that perhaps the tide was turning, but commanders knew better than to celebrate. The Germans would not simply retreat. They would strike back, and they would strike hard. Von Arnim, now leading Axis forces in Tunisia, understood the danger immediately. If Americans broke through at Guettar and reached the coast, the entire German position in southern Tunisia would collapse. So he ordered the 10th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations. Germany possessed to attack and sweep the Americans back into the mountains. German officers studied the American advance closely. They saw the improved organization. They noticed deeper foxholes, better camouflage, tighter formations. They noted that American artillery moved as a unified system. Yet they still believed the Americans lacked staying power. They still assumed that once German armor advanced in strength, American lines would break just as they had at Kasserine. What they did not realize was that the Americans had changed faster than the Germans could imagine. Meanwhile, General Terry Allen was preparing his defense with a level of precision that stunned observers. He walked the front lines for hours, inspecting every trench, checking every firing sector, testing every communication line. He questioned junior officers, making sure they understood their positions and responsibilities. He ordered artillery officers to repeat range calculations again and again, until they could do them instantly under pressure. Engineers laid minefields exactly where German armor was likely to advance. Tank destroyers were dug in so skillfully that even from 50 meters away, they were nearly invisible. For the first time, American defensive positions looked like something out of a German manual. Layered, interlocked, reinforced, and deadly. By nightfall on March 22, everyone knew the attack would come at dawn. Soldiers sat quietly in their foxholes, adjusting helmets, loading magazines, checking rifle bolts. There was tension, but not the panic of Kasserine. This time the men felt something else: determination. And at 06:00 on the morning of March 23, when the first German tanks rolled out of the mountain pass and into the valley floor, the Americans watched silently, calmly, almost coldly. They had been waiting for this moment. They were ready, and unlike a month earlier, they were not planning to retreat. They were planning to win. The German tanks continued their advance across the valley floor, sunlight glinting off their armor as they picked up speed. The crews inside felt confident. They had crushed every Allied force they faced: Polish, French, British, Soviet, and a month earlier they had humiliated these same Americans at Kasserine Pass. To them, this was not a battle. It was a corrective measure, a simple reminder of German superiority. The Americans would break. They always broke, but when the German column reached 400 yards from the American forward line, the first explosion shattered the valley's morning stillness. A lead panzer lurched to the left, its track blown off by a buried mine. Another tank detonated seconds later, then a third. The entire formation slowed, bunching up instinctively to avoid the mines. Exactly as the Americans had predicted. Dust rose around them, crews shouting to one another, trying to reorganize. Up on the ridges, American forward observers did not shout or scramble. They simply watched through binoculars and whispered coordinates into their radios. In fire direction centers hidden behind the hills, officers confirmed range, wind, and angle. Then, with the precision of a machine, they issued a single order: fire for effect. The first artillery salvo fell like a curtain out of the sky. Dozens of guns across the sector, 105s, 155s, even heavy long-range pieces fired as one, their shells crossing above the valley and then plunging into the German formation. Explosions Explosions tore through the stalled tanks, engulfing them in black smoke and shards of metal. White phosphorus burst overhead, cascading like burning snow across vehicles and exposed infantry. Before the first explosions faded, the second salvo was already landing. Then the third, then the fourth. For 12 straight minutes, the valley disappeared in flame and earth-shaking thunder. German tank crews who survived the mines now found themselves trapped inside steel coffins, being hammered by high-explosive rounds. Those who bailed out stumbled into open ground where shrapnel ripped through the air. Half-tracks caught fire instantly, their thin armor melting under the heat. The minefield had fixed them in place. The artillery destroyed them in place. And not a single American soldier had yet fired a rifle. When the barrage finally lifted, the survivors were disoriented, deafened, and scattered. That was when the American tank destroyers opened fire. M3 gun motor carriages and M10s, hidden so well that German crews never saw them until the guns flashed, began picking off the remaining panzers with calm, methodical precision. Each shot was deliberate. Each shot punched straight through German armor. Within minutes, the German advance had collapsed completely. Tanks tried to retreat toward the pass, only to find the exit blocked by burning wrecks. Others attempted to push forward but were halted again by mines and renewed artillery fire. The valley had become a trap engineered deliberately, calculated meticulously, executed flawlessly. Major General Terry Allen watched through binoculars as German armor burned on the valley floor. His staff urged him to withdraw. When two German tanks staggered dangerously close to his command post, Allen didn't flinch. "I will like hell pull out," he said, "and I will shoot the first man who does." His men stayed. By 0900 hours, the German force was shattered. 30 tanks lay destroyed or disabled. Dozens of half-tracks were burning. The valley floor was littered with wreckage. But the Germans were not finished. They withdrew into the hills, furious, shaken, and determined to restore their honor. At 1645, they attacked again. This time the German armor swung round from a different direction, attempting to flank the Americans. They believed the Americans might be rigid strong only where they expected an attack, weak where they were surprised. But Allen had anticipated this. His artillery observers were posted across every approach. His tank destroyers were dug in at alternate firing positions. His infantry had overlapping lines of fire that covered the entire ridge. The moment the German flanking force appeared, American artillery began again, just as devastating, just as coordinated. The ground shook for miles as concentrated fire smashed into their ranks. German tanks attempted to maneuver, but the Americans had prepared kill zones in advance. Tank destroyers waited in ambush, firing at silhouettes outlined by smoke and flame. German infantry tried to advance, only to be cut down by machine guns placed precisely where Allen knew they would attempt to move. The second attack collapsed faster than the first. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division was withdrawing yet again, leaving behind more wreckage, more wounded, and more dead. They made no further attempt to break the American positions at Guettar. The transformation was complete. The American army that had been rooted at Kasserine Pass was gone. In its place stood a force that fought with discipline, coordination, and a confidence forged not from arrogance but from preparation. Word spread quickly. German reports acknowledged that American tactics had improved dramatically. British officers, who once doubted the Americans, began revising their opinions, and Eisenhower, reading battle reports late into the night, understood the significance immediately. This was no small victory. This was the moment American forces proved they could defeat experienced German divisions in open combat. But the soldiers who fought at Guettar weren't thinking about doctrine or reputation. They were thinking about the next attack, the next rage, the next order. They didn't see themselves as part of a historic transformation. They saw only their duty, their equipment, their comrades beside them in the foxholes. Yet history would remember them, because in less than 4 weeks they had done what no army in the modern world had done before. They had rebuilt themselves completely, ruthlessly, successfully under fire. The valley was quiet by evening. Smoke drifted upward from burning tanks. The sun dipped behind the ridges, and Terry Allen, standing at his command post, looked across the battlefield knowing something fundamental had changed. His man had held. They had won, and the Germans, who had mocked American soldiers a month earlier, were now retreating. What began as an effort to avoid another humiliation had become something far greater. The Americans had discovered their strength, and from this point forward, in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany, the world would see what that strength could do. When news of the battle reached Allied headquarters, the reports did not sound dramatic. There were no sweeping maneuvers, no deep penetrations, no iconic moments for newspapers to print. It was, on paper, a defensive action, a division holding its ground against a German attack. But the commanders who read the battle summaries understood what had truly happened. American forces had stood toe-to-toe with one of Germany's finest armored divisions, and had not just survived, they had dominated the engagement. The transformation that had begun in the ruins of Kasserine Pass was now undeniable, and its consequences would spread far beyond a single valley in Tunisia. American units across North Africa dissected the after-action reports. Officers who had once blamed soldiers for lack of discipline now saw the truth. The men had always been capable, but the leadership and doctrine had failed them. Now those failures had been corrected. Training programs were rewritten. Artillery schools adopted the new coordination procedures. Armor units restructured their tactical playbooks. Tank destroyer battalions studied the Guettar engagement like scripture. Even air liaison doctrines began shifting based on what had happened in the Tunisian desert. In the weeks following the battle, something subtle but profound began happening inside the American army. Confidence, real, earned, sober confidence spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had once wondered whether they could match German troops no longer asked that question. They had faced Germany's veterans and beaten them. They had seen German tanks burning. They had heard German engines go silent in the valley below. No newspaper headline could give them that kind of certainty. They had witnessed it with their own eyes. As the Americans pushed north with British forces closing from the east, the Axis position in Tunisia crumbled. The Germans and Italians fell back to defensive lines, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Every mile the Americans advanced reinforced the lesson of Guettar. They were no longer reacting to German initiative, now the Germans were reacting to them. By late April, the Axis perimeter around Tunis was shrinking rapidly. German commanders sent increasingly grim reports to Berlin, admitting they could not hold much longer. The airfields were under constant pressure. Supply routes were collapsing, and the Americans, once dismissed as inexperienced and disciplined and unprepared, were now attacking with precision. When Tunis finally fell on May 7th and Bazar 2 days later, the end was certain. On May 13th, 1943, the remaining Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. More than 275,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. It was the largest mass surrender since Stalingrad, and embedded within that victory was the story of a single division that refused to break. A division whose stand at Guettar had ensured that the German counteroffensive failed before it even began. But the impact of Guettar did not end with Tunisia. The lessons learned there shaped every subsequent American campaign in Europe. When American forces landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, the contrast with Tunisia was unmistakable. Units coordinated closely with naval gunfire and air support. Infantry, armor, and artillery moved as a single organism. Communications ran smoothly. Officers made decisions rapidly without waiting for approval from distant headquarters. The sloppy improvisation that had characterized early North African operations had been replaced with deliberate planning and professional execution. German commanders fighting in Sicily quickly noticed the change. Reports from Panzer Division Hermann Göring described American artillery as rapid and overwhelming. German officers remarked on the Americans' ability to shift forces quickly, maintain pressure, and exploit weaknesses with speed. These were not the same soldiers who had been routed at Kasserine Pass. These were soldiers who had rebuilt themselves and now understood exactly how to fight the German war machine. The improvement continued in Italy. The fighting at Salerno, San Pietro, and Anzio showed an American army capable of absorbing heavy pressure and then counterattacking with devastating force. Artillery coordination, refined first in the Tunisian desert, became the backbone of every major engagement. German commanders began referring to American artillery as an iron rain. They had never seen fire missions delivered with such precision, density, and speed. By the time American units began preparing for the invasion of France in June 1944, their reputation had changed entirely. British commanders who had once questioned whether the Americans could fight now acknowledged that American divisions were among the most adaptable in the Allied coalition. German intelligence reports listed American artillery, logistics, and mobility as major strategic threats. Eisenhower, reflecting on the transformation years later, said that Guettar had been the first moment he truly knew that American forces would not just participate in the war, but would play a decisive role in winning it. The legacy of the battle extended even further into the doctrine of the post-war American military. After-action reviews became institutionalized. Rapid adaptation became a core principle. Training emphasized combined arms integration from the first day a soldier entered the service. Officers were expected to learn from failures instead of hiding them. The cultural shift that began in February and March of 1943 hardened into a permanent feature of American military identity, and yet the soldiers who fought at Guettar rarely spoke of doctrine or legacy. Many of them didn't live to see Sicily, Italy, or France. Those who did often described the battle not as a turning point but simply as a day. They had done their job. They remembered the heat, the dust, the sound of artillery rounds screaming overhead. They remembered the white phosphorus bursting in brilliant arcs. They remembered the German tanks grinding forward. They remembered the silence afterward, the eerie stillness that follows a battle when the smoke lifts, and the valley lies quiet and broken. They may not have realized they were participants in the fastest large-scale military transformation of the war, but history would remember it for them, because from that valley in Tunisia came the blueprint for how the American army would fight and win throughout the rest of World War I. The speed, the flexibility, the willingness to learn, and their refusal to repeat old mistakes all traced back to the humiliation at Kasserine and their redemption at Guettar. In later years, military historians would marvel at the transformation. They would ask how an army could change so completely in less than a month. They would point to American industry, leadership, decentralization, training, and resources. But the deeper answer was found in the foxholes of the 1st Infantry Division, in the tank destroyer pits, in the artillery batteries firing until their barrels glowed red. The answer was in the men who refused to break again, the men who were determined that Kasserine would not define them. When the sun rose over the Guettar Valley on March 24, 1943, the battlefield was strewn with burnt armor, shattered half-tracks, and abandoned weapons. The smell of smoke hung in the air. American medics moved quietly among the injured. Engineers began clearing mines. Tank crews inspected their positions, waiting for orders to move. And Major General Terry Allen stood at his command post, staring across the valley floor that his men had held. There were no speeches, no celebrations, no photographs, but every man there knew what they had accomplished. They had proven that the American army could not only fight the Germans, it could defeat the Germans. And from that moment on, the outcome of the war began to shift.